Flins is finally here, and this Lightkeeper is all about nuking his enemies with big lunar charge damage. However, to achieve the best results, there are some caveats you need to be aware of, which is why in this Flins Ultimate Guide video, I will go through every comp and rank his teammates, as well as explain to you his best artifact and weapon loadouts, and of course, I'll also provide a brief explanation of Flint's skid and Constellations. Now, keep in mind, this video was made thanks to Creator Experience server, so content shown here is subject to change. Okay, so in a nutshell, Flins specializes in dealing damage with his burst, which will cause a ton of lunar charge damage. But he also absolutely requires another Nodicry unit to be present in the team, since he ends up dealing about 2.5 times less damage if he's the only Nodicry unit, because then half his skid is disabled, and in result, he ends up missing out on about 6 to 7 buffs, which includes his powered up bursts. So yeah, as of now, you need to use Aino, Ineffa, or Llama to fully enable him, and I'll talk about these 3 Nodicry units and the rest of his team options later on in the video. But moving over to his kit explanation, many videos including the one I posted previously have gone into great detail explaining how he works, so instead, I will briefly cover his abilities so we can focus on the rotations, build options, and teams. Although honestly, he's quite simple once you understand the basics. Okay, so first of all, when looking at his normal attacks, I don't recommend leveling them because they deal negligible damage, and he will barely use them in his rotations, or like almost never besides when his skill runs out and you accidentally land a few white hits, and then at that point, you just swap out anyway. And so, this brings us to his elemental skill. When tapped, for 10 seconds he gains Electro Infusion and resistance to interruption. On top of that, his skill button can be tapped again to deal a little bit of damage, but more importantly, now his burst will start to glow, and for 30 energy, when it's pressed, he will unleash a mini burst, dealing 2 counts of lunar charge damage. The first hit with a free-to-play build usually results in 200k damage, and second hit would be about 300k. But obviously, this depends on team buffs and his build. Then the skill goes onto a 6-second cooldown, and it can be pressed again afterwards while he's in his electro state, which yet again deals a bit of damage, and you can use the mini burst once more. In total, you can unleash 2 mini bursts while the skill duration lasts. Oh, and as I said before, if he was the only Nodicry unit in the team, then the mini burst would only deal 1 count of lunar charge damage, which is a massive loss for him. So moving onwards, I am always going to assume you're playing him with another Nodicry unit in the team. Now, as you've noticed, his electro-infused normal attacks while the skill lasts deal decent amount of damage, and on top of that, every 2 seconds he can generate 1 energy particle, so a maximum of 5 can be obtained within 10-second duration. But usually, it will range between 3 to 5 particles, depending on how well you can land those attacks. Anyway, moving over to the big burst, well, technically it's his regular burst, but it's easier to distinguish it by calling it big. Basically, it costs 80 energy and has a long 20-second cooldown. However, thankfully, it does not share this cooldown with the mini burst. And looking at the damage breakdown, initially he deals a bit of electro damage, something like 40k, then 4 small lunar charge hits descend, each dealing roughly 40 to 45k damage, and then the final big lunar charge hit is delivered, decimating the enemy for roughly 310k damage. These numbers were achieved with the loadout shown here, as all the other damage you've been seeing so far, but it can be higher or lower, depending on his team and build. Still, when we add everything up, this big burst deals about as much damage as 1 mini burst. So, is there any point using it? Well, it depends on how much energy recharge Flins has, because usually he needs about 125 to 130% ER to consistently deliver 2 mini bursts every rotation. But if you want to use his big burst in addition, he would need around 175% to 180% ER. But even then, he could only deliver the big burst and the 2 mini bursts like every 3rd rotation or so. This playstyle, which I'm calling it triple burst, is definitely very strong for any opening rotation like in Spiral Abyss. And if you do end up achieving enough ER with him, it's worth including his big burst every other rotation. But this depends of course how you build him, and I'll talk about it in a moment, so for now, let's quickly take a look at his rotations. Okay, so first of all, the most basic rotation would be just him utilizing the 2 mini bursts. You can see everyone's rotations here, and when it comes to Flins, when you swap to him, first tap the skill, then quickly tap it again, and then unleash the first mini burst. Afterwards, spam his normal attacks until his skill's cooldown is over, tap it again, and deliver the second mini burst. Pretty simple. However, you can add some variations. For example, at the start, after tapping the skill, quickly do a single normal attack so he can generate a particle and catch it after his second skill tap and mini burst. Or if you're using Neon Sun, you can also go for this rotation, where he keeps dashing every few normal attacks, so he can maintain the stronger attack buff from Neon Sun. Otherwise, you could also, instead of just spamming his normal combo, go for a repeating string of 4th normal hit followed by charge attack, which results in a bit more damage, instead of finishing with normal 5 hit. Finally, if you're playing the triple burst playstyle, it's pretty simple. Just immediately tap the burst button when you swap to him, and then do the exact same rotation to achieve the 2 mini bursts after. Also, keep in mind, usually when using Sucrose and you swap from her to Flins, he should be able to capture animal particles during his big burst animation. But if you somehow caught those particles with Sucrose, then when it's Flins' turn, just tap his skill and do one normal attack and do the big burst, so he at least catches his own particle during it. Like, the thing is, energy management for Flins is crucial because he absolutely needs it to achieve either the 2 mini bursts or the triple burst playstyle, so every particle for him matters. Alright, the last thing to go over would be his passives. His third passive enables Lunar-Charged reactions, which we're already aware of, but also, the base damage of Lunar-Charge is increased by 0.7% for every 100 attack Flins has, and this maxes out at 14% or when he has reached 2000 attack, which will happen naturally with any weapon to be honest. His second passive takes 8% of his attack and converts it to additional EM, up to 160, which coincidentally also maxes out at 2000 attack. And then finally, his first passive states that whenever the team is in Ascendant Gleam state, which should always be the case, the Lunar-Charge reaction damage caused by Flins is increased by 20%. Oh, and as a quick refresher on how Lunar-Charged works, as I said before, this third passive states that whenever anybody would trigger Electro-Charge reaction, it instead becomes Lunar-Charged, which summons this cloud above the enemy for 8 seconds, and every 2 seconds, provided there's ongoing Hydro and Electro application happening, Lunar-Charge reaction is caused, which can become a critical hit, scales with elemental mastery and character's level, ignores enemy's defense, benefits from resistance shred, so Electro resistance shred, and most importantly, anyone who applied Hydro or Electro contribute to the reaction, which takes a look at their critical rate and damage, elemental mastery and level, and then based on that, the first highest damage dealer fully contributes, the second highest only half of their damage is added, and the other third and fourth, if any, contribute 1/12 of their damage. In other words, we can see for example, once Flins is on the field, Lunar-Charge reaction damage goes up by a lot more because he has the best stats out of everyone in the team. However, the Lunar-Charge damage his mini burst and big burst deals works a little differently because here only Flint's stats matter, and in addition to everything else that I mentioned, attack is also added into the damage formula, and this is why you always want to run him with Attack Goblet because damage percent are not added into Lunar-Charge damage, and in total, his Lunar-Charge damage coming from mini burst and big burst contribute to about 73% of his total damage. Or basically, by taking a look at his free-to-play team rotation, he deals roughly 1.16 million damage with Lunar-Charged, and only 150,000 with his skill and infused normal attacks. So yeah, he basically specializes in dealing Lunar-Charged damage. Alright, enough with the kit yapping, let's move over to his builds and teams. Okay, so first of all, when it comes to talents leveling priority, focus first on maxing out the burst talent because both the mini burst and big burst are located here, and they deal Lunar-Charge damage. Then you can raise the skill talent to level 9, and as for normal attacks, I wouldn't waste resources, but I guess you could raise them to level 6 at most. Or if you're a diehard optimizer, sure, level them to 9 as well. Now, there are many ways how you can optimize Flint's potential, so let's first start by going through his artifact sets. Currently, his best in slot is going to be Night of the Skies Unveiling, and sadly, no other set can catch up to it. Other options include Gilded Dreams, but he already starts with 160 Elemental Mastery thanks to his second passive. Then another support can give him 120 EM with Silken Moon Serenade, and if you're playing with Sucrose, she can on average boost Flint's EM by 210. And finally, if Ineffa is in the team, she can also provide at least 150 EM on average. So without any additional EM from artifacts, he can already have around 650 EM. So that extra EM coming from Gilded Dreams starts to provide diminishing returns. And remember, he can have even more EM from substats or when equipped with Night Sky. So in short, Gilded Dreams is fine if you don't have his best in slot set, but otherwise, it's alright as a placeholder. Then there's Thundering Fury. It provides electro damage percent and a bit of Lunar-Charge damage increase, which is fine. However, the ability to reduce the skill's cooldown only works on its initial tap, the 16-second cooldown. It will not reduce the cooldown on his second skill tap. It always has 6-second cooldown. So, can you do anything with this set then? Well, in some niche cases, after his Electro Infusion expires, you can can usually reactivate the skill immediately, which can help you finish off an enemy if they are low on HP. Otherwise, you could also use these 2 skill durations in a row to stay on the field longer, but most of the buffs will have expired by then, and his damage sharply declines. Usually, I would recommend using this set either with Aino or Furina in the team, since Aino's cooldowns are short, while Furina's skill can last for a very long time. But overall, this set is pretty advanced, and maybe others can find it to work pretty well, but in the end, it's still lacking behind his best in slots set. Lastly, there's the Hunter set when playing together with Furina, but she takes up Hydro slot, so you're forced to either use Ineffa or Lauma, and I don't recommend Lauma at all. So if you go for Ineffa, then the last slot has to be Anemo unit, or someone like Benny or Shallonen. If you go for Anemo, you'd think Jean or Shanyun as healers would make sense, since they can help fluctuate his HP so he can maintain the critical rate buff from this set, but he ends up missing out on so much buffing that Sucrose could otherwise provide. So then, you're pretty much left with Shallonen, who can at least shred resistance, and her burst can heal, which would be the ideal situation. Lastly, with Benny, no resistance shred means even if Benny gives a big attack boost, Flint's potential still remains lacking. So overall, if you do decide to use this set, I can only recommend it right now in Ineffa, Furina, and Shallonen team to help maintain the critical rate buff. Finally, if you don't have any of these options, just go for a 2-piece with either 18% attack or 80 EM. Alright, let's now talk about Flynn's main stats. Typically, his recommended main stats would be Attack Sans, Attack % Goblet, and Critical Rate or Damage Circlet. I do not recommend using on him Electro Damage Goblet simply because, as I said before, Lunar Charge damage he deals does not scale in any way with damage % stat, and so this stat for him is only useful to boost the skill and infuse normal attack damage, which makes up a minor part of his total damage output. Still, if you somehow end up with Flins in a team where he doesn't gain a lot of elemental mastery, you could instead use EM Sans or Goblet, but the substats on them would have to be very good, and I would still recommend putting him in a team where he can gain a lot of EM buffs instead. As the last option, if you decide to go for triple burst playstyle, and if using ER Sans helps you achieve at least 175 to 180% ER, then this can be a good choice. Just keep in mind, having this amount of ER only allows him to unleash triple burst playstyle every 2 or 3 rotations, depending on how much energy the enemy or boss provides. But overall, both mini burst or triple burst playstyle are balanced around each other, with triple burst having the better damage output on first rotation. Finally, let's talk about the substat priority. First of all, make sure he at least achieves the minimum energy requirements of 125 to 130% ER. Then focus on critical rate or damage, followed by attack %, and then elemental mastery. Flat attack also helps. Next, if you somehow end up with a ton of energy recharge from substats, the requirement to do triple burst every 3rd rotation is shown here. But if you want to trigger it more often, here are the rest of the ER requirements, which keeps increasing if you want to do the triple burst every 3rd, 2nd, or 1st rotation. Safe to say, these numbers are pretty unrealistic to achieve, unless you use something like Favonian's Lance, but then the damage suffers, of course. Look, long story short, the most basic build you can follow if using, let's say, Prospector Shovel, or basically any polearm without ER substat, would be to first make sure he obtains 125 to 130% ER, then go for attack % Sans, attack % Goblet, and critical rate or damage circlet. That's it. You'll be able to unleash 2 mini bursts very easily every rotation, and he will be super strong. After playing around with this build, if you decide you want to try and go for triple burst, he just needs higher energy recharge, as I've mentioned many times, which either needs to be achieved by using ER Sans, ER Substat Polearm, or if you rolled a ton of ER substats. It couldn't be more simple. Anyway, last thing I want to go over would be his weapon options. His signature compared to Prospector's is about 18% better. However, because it allows Flins to regain 12 energy, he would only need about 140% ER to enable the triple burst playstyle, which can be done with about 8 energy recharge substat rolls. And then this weapon becomes like nearly 30% stronger. Or we can also just ignore the triple burst playstyle, and with just base 100% ER, this weapon is still enough for him to play the 2 mini bursts consistently. Safe to say, this is a very powerful weapon on him, although it's not as great as his Constellations, which I'll talk about later on. Then we have a bunch of 5-star stat sticks, which I won't really cover any of them. You can look at the damage ranking graph here. They're all pretty much lagging behind the signature, although one notable exception would be Staff of Homa, because when in a team with Furina, she won't need to trigger her burst, so just give her something like Tenacity Artifact and Favonia's Sword, and then Flins will stay at 50% HP constantly, since thanks to Furina's skill, Homa's passive gets enabled to the fullest, which actually ends up as the 2nd strongest weapon option for Flins. Finally, as for free-to-play options, Prospector's Shovel is the best pick here. Although, if you don't want to bother crafting it 5 times, you can also use Missive Wind Spear, which as you can see is only a few percent behind it. Just keep in mind, this was a free limited event weapon that was given away long time ago. Otherwise, yeah, just pick and choose one of the weapons, whichever you see has the best damage potential here, and see if you can build it around with artifacts. Anyway, let's talk about his teams next. So, to make things more interesting, let me start by first saying that his best current meta team right now is Ineffa, C6 Aino or Yelan, and Sucrose. And then his best free-to-play team without Ineffa would be Aino, ELECTRO teammate, usually Auroran or Yansun, and Sucrose. If you don't have Ineffa and play his free-to-play comp, the team ends up missing out on about 20 to 25% potential damage. Or in other words, that's how much Ineffa provides value for Flins. It's not as dramatic of a damage drop-off when compared to Escoffier and Skirk, and honestly, there's a ton of ways how you can approach team compositions with Flins, even if he really only has one archetype, which is basically going to be Flins, Hydro, Electro, and then either Animal or another support. So, let's first go through all Electro options if you're playing the free-to-play comp without Ineffa. So, I'm assuming here Aino will be in the Hydro slot. And starting with Auroran, his personal damage is decent, and his burst can taunt the enemies sometimes. Other than that, he can provide damage percent buff with Cinder City, but as I've said before, Flins really doesn't value it that much since Lunar-Charged doesn't scale with it, and his infused normals, skill, and that initial burst hit don't contribute that much to his entire damage output. However, C6 Auroran can provide quite a large attack buff, and this turns him into one of the best picks if you don't have Ineffa. Next we have Yansun. Her burst provides a large attack buff. It can be maintained with his C4, although you will need to run around with Flins like a madman to keep the higher attack buff. And then, yeah, she can also give Cinder City buff, or you could give her Noblesse set as well. Just keep in mind, Yansun's 18-second cooldown might require you to extend the rotation by a bit. Then there's Cookie. Honestly, she's pretty decent because not only can she heal, but also provides consistent particle generation from her skill, helping Flins with energy needs. Yes, her damage will be useless, but in a rare case where you decide to run her in a team with Lauma, she can become a Hyper Bloom triggerer. On a similar note, we have Dory. Her burst cooldown is very long sadly, and even if she does heal, Cookie just remains a better option. Now, we also have Lisa. Yeah, you might be thinking, since her burst shreds defense, she's good, right? Well, Lunar Charge reactions and damage already ignores enemies' defense. So no, Lisa is just not a good pick. Even if she can wield Thrilling Tales, the rotations are going to be quite awkward. What about Beidou? How about no? Very long burst cooldown, and she's also hungry for energy. Alright, then we have Fischl. I'd say she's a better option than Cookie if you don't care about healing, because she will also provide more particles for Flins, and her personal damage of course will be quite decent. So if you want that, she's good. Then we have the 5-star counterpart, Yaimiko. She's there for personal damage and particle generation, but her field time is much longer than Fischl's, and don't even bother using her burst. On the flip side, she can use Thrilling Tales, but just like Lisa, it's hard to fit this buff into Flint's rotations with another support unit. Then we have Electro Traveler, and this is where I will say your mileage may vary because, on one hand, Electro Traveler can be a really nice pick for Flins if the stars align, but for this to happen, Flins would need to pick up all 3 amulets left by Traveler to get the energy, the Electro Res reduction won't happen every rotation from the burst, and you also have to think about Traveler's energy needs as well. Overall, Electro Traveler is iffy to evaluate, but potentially he is good with triple burst Flins. Finally, we have Kujo Sara. Due to her buff's very short duration, and assuming we're talking about C6 Sara here, I didn't have any luck boosting both his mini bursts with Sara's attack buff. Maybe I'm missing something here, although if you unlock Flint's first constellation, you could then boost 2 of his 3 mini bursts. So overall, C6 Sara is pretty good with C1 Flins, and kinda decent with C0 Flins. Okay, I think that covers all the logical Electro candidates if you don't have Ineffa. But what if you do have her? Well, let's talk about the Hydro options then. And first, we have Aino. Now, why use Aino if Ascendant Gleam is already activated with Ineffa? Well, at C0, Aino is more or less just there to exist if you don't want to use any other Hydro option. But C6 Aino does increase Lunar Charge damage, and thanks to this, she becomes Flint's best in slot Hydro option, although she's like a few % better than others. In fact, if you go for Kokomi or Barbara, they are about as good as C0 Aino. They can also use Thrilling Tales, but usually it's better to give them sacrificial fragments to maintain their hydro application in a much easier way. And besides, Thrilling Tales can be given to someone like Sucrose or Lanyan. Other than that, use these hydro girls if you need a healing, basically. Oh, and you can give Kokimi the Tenacity set. Speaking of which, Siegewein can be utilized with something like Elegy for the End and Tenacity set. Her skill's Bubble Bounce can keep the artifact's buff going for a bit, but I did notice rotations with her sometimes can be unreliable when it comes to maintaining Lunar Charged on the enemy, so keep that in mind. Next, we have Mona. Her Constellations can provide Lunar Charge boost from C1 and critical rate increase from C4, but the problem lies in her maintaining Lunar Charge with Hydro application. So she's fine, but a bit more challenging to use. Moving over to the funny hairstyle duo, Xingqiu and Yelan perform a similar function, and that is a lot of Hydro application, which, to be honest, you don't need a lot of it in Flint's teams, just enough. So with Xingqiu, he can provide a bit of healing, damage reduction, and good personal damage, while Yelan can be equipped with Elegy for the End, and her burst can provide damage percent for Flint's, but as we've already established, he doesn't really benefit a lot from it. Also, Xingqiu has a very long burst cooldown, which extends Flint's rotations, and this results in worse performance, especially in timed content like Abyss or Stygian. Overall, Yelan is a lot better than Xingqiu here, and compared to C6 Aino, Yelan is only a few percent behind in terms of overall performance, but slightly becomes better with Elegy for the End. Now, there's also Farina, and as I've talked about it before, she can help enable Staff of Homa very easily with no healer in the team, but her personal damage will be quite low after you give her something like Tenacity set and Favonius Sword. Also, you won't need to use Farina's burst in Flint's teams because the other two teammates won't really care about it, and usually, you don't want to spend those seconds on her burst animation anyway. Lastly, we have Candace, and I'm only going to mention her as a C6 option because otherwise, her Hydro application is not good enough. She can give a little bit of damage percent to Flint's infused normals, but otherwise, just use C6 Candace if you don't have or don't want to use any other Hydro option. Okay, so with the Hydro units out of the way, let's talk about the last slot, the support. Now, I'm going to make this very simple. Use Sucrose. Not only her rotation is just press the skill and swap out, but you can easily use Thrilling Tales and pass it to Flins who can fully utilize it, and on top of that, her artifact's VV Resistance Shred will be crucial at boosting his damage and the team's, and if that's not enough, she provides a ton of elemental mastery for the team through her talents. Although, keep in mind, Thrilling Tales does have a long cooldown, and this can result in Flins losing out on it every other rotation, so you can give her something like Wandering Even Star instead. The only other animal option I could recommend using instead of her would be Lanyan, and only if you struggle to stay alive with the team because, as you've noticed, there aren't that many healers you can pick from. So Lanyan's shielding can help with this in exchange of losing out on potential EM boosts that Sucrose could otherwise provide. As for the remaining Anemo units, there's Kazuha who has a much longer rotation than Sucrose or Lanyan, and even at C2 with Freedom Sorn, he still ends up worse than Sucrose. There's also Venti, but because his burst prioritizes absorbing Hydro, he won't help Flins recover 15 energy, sadly. So again, a lot worse than Sucrose or Lanyan. At this point, instead of the first Archon, you could go for Asmantheus Wine Guy because at least he can give a fat shield to the team, and he can still provide 20% resistance shred, and you can give him Tenacity as well. Petra is very random to trigger though. Now, if you play a team that can somehow reduce enemies' resistance, or the enemy has low resistance to Electro, Benny can work as a big attack booster, but otherwise, he's not as great as just going with Anemo option. But for example, against Hydro Tulpa who has innate Hydro Aura, you can use Benny in Chevra's teams, so Flint's can then deliver some insane damage. But yeah, finally we have Shilonen. While she's not as great as Sucrose, the resistance shred she provides from the skill can persist through multi-wave content. Her rotation is also very short, and while the damage percent buff she can provide with Cinder City, and perhaps if you have her signature aren't super beneficial, she is still more or less the second best choice for Flins after Sucrose. Oh, and yeah, as for Lauma, you can play her with Flins, but remember, her own passive turns off critical rate chance for Hyperblooms, and honestly, she's better off utilized in another Hyperbloom, Burgeon, or Nilobloom team instead. But there you have it. All the teammates have been ranked, you can see them here. Overall, I'd say the best way to approach this is by just using Sucrose, but if you need extra survivability, then go for Lanyan. Otherwise, if you don't have Ineffa, use Auroran, Iansan, Cookie, or Fischl. And if you do have Ineffa, then C6 Aino, Yelan, or Farina are the best picks. Although honestly, just pick any Hydra from this list, it will be totally fine. The last thing I want to go over would be what artifact sets to use on Flynn's teammates. In general, you always want VV set on Animo, and then Silken Moon Serenade and Tenacity are the next best choices. Otherwise, there's Noblesse set and Cinder City. To keep things simple, I've made a reference table for you with a good number of team comps shown here, so you can see for yourself which set the character should use. But overall, for something like Serenade set, it can be on anybody really. It's super easy to trigger it, so just give it to someone who needs ER from the 2-set bonus. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's talk about Flint's Constellations now. Okay, so starting with C1, it's a pretty powerful upgrade for Flins because he can now unleash an additional mini burst. Plus, he can recover up to 24 flat energy within a single rotation. However, since he can unleash 3 mini bursts now, his energy needs also go up. Now he wants to have at least 9 to 16% more ER to trigger all 3 mini bursts, and on top of that, the big burst animation time becomes too long for him to then unleash the 3rd mini burst after. Well, at least from my own experience, since I did have some lag on the server, but I am initially reserving my thoughts here that it's better to avoid using big burst and just go for 3 mini bursts instead. Overall, because he gains a ton of damage from his C1 when using mini bursts, this constellation is roughly as good as having C0 Ineffa on the team in terms of damage potential. Next, we have C2, and it's also very powerful. Now, after using the 2nd skill tap, his next infused normal triggers an extra Lunar-Charged hit, which isn't as big as mini burst, but it's still quite powerful. More importantly, C2 also now shreds 25% of enemies' electro resistance, which is amazing both for him and if Ineffa is in the team. In fact, this constellation is good enough that you can even go for supports who do not shred resistance, like Benny. Now, C3, as usual, gives +3 levels to the burst, which means his lunar charge damage becomes improved, and this results in about 10% damage increase. A pretty decent upgrade. C4 is kind of generic, but in a good sense. Basically, Flynn's attack is increased by 20%, and he also gains 60 extra EM. Not a big boost in personal performance, but it's okay. What's not okay though is C5. It's kind of useless. The 3 extra levels for the skill barely push his damage output by 1% compared to every other unlocked constellation on him so far. So yeah, you only get C5 if you're planning to C6 him. And speaking of the Primo Gem sucker, it's a simple yet powerful upgrade. His lunar charge damage is elevated by 35% and additional 10% when in Ascendant Gleam state. More or less, this means lunar charge damage hits now for 1.45 times higher damage. Oh, and the 10% elevation actually applies to all teammates, so Ineffa can benefit from this too. Long story short, if you see people hitting bosses for around 1 million lunar charge damage, you're looking at C6 Flins. Overall, I'd say the first 2 constellations are very powerful upgrades for Flins, especially C1 if you don't have Ineffa. As for his signature, I'd only pull for it if you don't have one of the higher rated 5-star stat sticks from the weapons table shown here. And keep in mind, the extra energy Flins gains from the signature also becomes kind of useless because it mostly matters when using his big burst. So if you want to scale his damage vertically, I recommend focusing on his constellations. Although if you pull up to C2, then getting signature is better than C3. And yeah, that's pretty much his guide. I think this is my longest guide so far. And one thing I like to note is that currently, with only 3 Nodicry units to choose from for Flins, I do believe he still has good future potential whenever another Nodicry support comes out because, as you saw yourself, his Hydro options are like whatever, and there's still ways he can grow in power. But anyway, leave a comment if you have a question, I'll try and answer it, but I'd also appreciate if you could press the like button on this video to help with the algorithm, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching me, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.